Welcome to the Business of Story. Today's episode is sponsored by Wix e-commerce, the professional platform that enables entrepreneurs just like you from all over the world to create and run their own online store and grow their e-commerce business. Hi, I'm Park Howell, and I'm so glad you are here. You know, besides this show, I can help you and your sales, marketing, and leadership teams excel through the stories you tell with my virtual and in-person masterclasses and mastery courses. But you know what one of the most powerful stories you can use is? It's your origin story. Why you do what you do that your audiences, prospects, customers, and colleagues find so authentically endearing that it builds immediate trust for who you are and what you're all about. But sharing your origin story might make you feel a bit squeamish because, does anyone really care?
It's very easy to talk about reflecting on your story and maybe sharing it with the world, but there's a real fear factor, I think, in putting yourself out there, right? Vulnerability is a real buzzword at the moment, and there is that question, well, how vulnerable do I need to be?
That's what we're going to cover today with Robert Tighe. He has been working with words for 20 years, initially as an award-winning journalist and more recently as a copywriter, storytelling consultant, and #1 best-selling ghostwriter. When I look through LinkedIn, no one talks more about the importance of how to craft and tell your origin story than Robert. That's why I reached out to him to be on the show, because we just haven't covered this topic in the past 6.5 years. Robert was previously the New Zealand country editor for the Red Bulletin, an adventure lifestyle magazine published by Red Bull, before he started his own company to help businesses tell better stories. He worked with founders, owners, entrepreneurs, business leaders, and consultants to find and tell their origin stories and to share them with the world. Telling better stories enables leaders to clarify their purpose so they can communicate with confidence, connect with stakeholders, and lead with purpose. Today, you will learn how to craft your origin story by finding the 3 different stages of your life that uncover the stories that have shaped you, changed you, and defined who you are. Plus, we'll talk about the importance of story selection and the power of reframing to reinterpret your past to your advantage, and how reflecting on your story can help you ask the question, what do you want to be known for? Toward the end of the show, you will hear me ask Robert if he has an origin story worksheet for you so that you can work on your own worksheet. And guess what? He provided an emphatic no. So you know what I did? I nudged him. I said, hey man, can you create one? And let's put it into the show notes. Well, Robert did, to his credit. Go to the show notes. You can download it for absolutely free, ungated content, and you can start working on your origin story today, following the great insights that Robert is about to share. So let's delve in to the origins of your origin story with Robert Tighe. Robert, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Park. Lovely to be here.
And you are coming to us from where?
I am in Auckland, New Zealand. I've lived here for almost 20 years now. As you can guess from the accent, I'm a long way from home. I'm originally from Ireland, obviously, but Auckland has been my home for the last 20 years. And I count myself, really lucky to be an adopted Kiwi, if you like.
How did you find yourself in Auckland?
Well, as I said, I grew up in Ireland, in the west of Ireland, actually, on a dairy farm. And I grew up milking cows, wondering, when it would stop raining. I don't know how many people have been to Ireland, but it rains quite a lot in Ireland. And from an early age, I think I thought about living in some other part of the world where it rained a lot less than it did in Ireland. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm very proud of my roots and I'm a very proud Irishman. But my mum tells this story that when I was 8 years old, I said to her, Mom, I said, I'm never living in Ireland when I grow up. And she said, why? And I said, because it rains too much. So I think from an early age, I had this kind of curiosity about, what else was out there in the world. And to cut a long story short, in terms of how I ended up in New Zealand, of course, there was a woman involved. In my late 20s, I met a Kiwi woman in Dublin. She'd been living in Dublin for a couple of years, and we met and we hit it off. And she's an incredible woman, and it was a very easy decision to make, to say, yeah, let's make a life on the other side of the world. So yeah, that was in my late 20s, and yeah, 20 years later, here I am in sun-soaked New Zealand.
That's quite a story. And you've been a journalist out there. You got the chance to work on the Red Bulletin, Red Bull's magazine out there in New Zealand. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Was that like really fun stuff, working with those different athletes? I mean, extreme athletes in every sense of the word.
Yeah, Park, that was a dream job. I edited the New Zealand country version of the Red Bulletin magazine for 5 years, and just to be clear, it's published by Red Bull, but I was working for the magazine. I was working with Red Bull Media House, which is headquartered in Austria. So out of Austria, they published 12 different country versions of this one magazine, the Red Bulletin. So my role was to, I suppose, find and write great stories in New Zealand and Australia, in this part of the world. So that involved working with the sponsored athletes that Red Bull sponsors, obviously the extreme athletes that we all think about. And they were just incredible people to work with. I mean, I think a lot of it, for me, at least, it was a real eye-opener. I think we all think of these extreme athletes as, you know, being a bit out there, being a bit crazy. But in actual fact, working with them, because they're essentially entrepreneurs themselves, they have to market themselves, they have to promote themselves. They're really measured and calculated, and they're really thoughtful about what they do. And so as a journalist, they were incredible to work with because they're so self-motivated, and they all had just great stories to tell. Unlike team sports, for example, where a lot of athletes, you know, follow the same route. You know, they're obviously, you know, star players when they're younger and they go into an academy system or whatever. But the Red Bull athletes were just, you know, fantastic to work with. And in terms of being exposed to the Red Bull brand, I think the tagline of the magazine was to think beyond the ordinary and to deliver the unexpected. And I think they're two really great mottos to keep in mind when people are telling stories. I mean, obviously not everyone can do what Red Bull athletes do, but if you can tell unexpected stories with a twist that go beyond the ordinary, I think you've got a much better chance of connecting with your audience, right?
Well, and certainly with Red Bull, you know, when you look at that product where Red Bull gives you wings, it's always about pushing you beyond what you think you can do, you know, your own self-prescribed limitations. One thing you and I have in common kind of out there is that our son, Parker, produced Red Bull's very first, I got to get this right, 3D first-person virtual reality music video using a local pop star from Auckland, New Zealand by the name of Valette. And it was so powerful, about 2 years ago, that video won the South Pacific Music Video of the Year award. And so I'm a very proud father because I've got the video of them announcing that in Auckland, from some stage in Auckland with the big crowd there pre-COVID, and Valette walking up on stage and accepting that award. And it was just really fun because I got a chance to kind of glimpse in the backstage of Red Bull as Parker was making this film and everything they went through shooting it in downtown LA. And they had one night to do it. And then they had to pull off some pretty miraculous software hacks to be able to make all this third-person and virtual reality stuff work. And it was very, very cool. So when I saw that you had worked also with Red Bull Publishing, I thought, well, Robert, we have that in common too. I didn't work for him, but I did get a glimpse into it. And it was all about storytelling.
It is all about storytelling. And I was so lucky in that I was given more or less free rein to find stories about exceptional people doing exceptional things was essentially my remit. Yeah, obviously, you've got the stereotypical Red Bull image of the extreme sports, but I was also interviewing and talking to musicians and actors and entrepreneurs. And for me, that whole process was all about kind of origin storytelling, essentially, you know, by encouraging these people or asking them to reflect on their past to unlock their motivations and their passions for what they did. You know, their eyes lit up as they kind of reflected on their journey, you know, from rookies at whatever they were doing to experts. And for me, that origin story process was at the heart of the stories that I wrote for Red Bulletin. It was all about trying to help readers understand what made these people tick, right?
And is that what then got you into doing this for brands and leaders and companies and so forth?
Yeah, more or less. So, the Red Bulletin magazine, as I said, was about 5 years. I worked on the magazine down here in New Zealand. It folded because there was a kind of a league table of those 12 different countries who were publishing the magazine. And unfortunately, New Zealand being quite a small country and a small market, we struggled to get enough advertising dollars to make a dent on the league table. And so they were, rethinking their strategy. And unfortunately, the magazine got pulled. And I realized then it had been creeping up on me for a while that journalism was, a tough business, and it was struggling, and I was looking for something else where I could use my storytelling abilities. And luckily for me, one of the last stories I wrote for the Red Bulletin was about a guy called Tony Quinn. Now, Tony Quinn is a Scottish entrepreneur who made his fortune in Australia selling pet food, of all things, Park. And he invested some of his millions in his passion for motorsport. And he built this world-class racetrack. I'm talking about a $30 million investment in a racetrack in the South Island of New Zealand, in central Otago, near Queenstown. So an incredible, thing to do. Most people thought he was crazy, but it's since turned into like a massive tourist destination where people get the opportunity to jump in a race car, and have a drive around the track. So I went down to see this guy, Tony Quinn, and I spent the weekend with him. And he was just a wonderful, wonderful character, really driven, but really down to earth, and a really great storyteller. He absolutely was born with the gift of the gab, Tony was. And over the course of the weekend, he told me that he was trying to write a book, that he wanted to write his life story. And he told me that he'd already fired 2 writers because they didn't quite get him. They didn't click with him. And that didn't put me off, funnily enough. Naively, I put my hand up and I offered to do the job. And I'm so glad that I did, because working as a ghostwriter with Tony on that book was life-changing for me. It really opened my eyes, I think, to the world of entrepreneurship and business. And the book went to #1 on the New Zealand bestsellers list. And from working with Tony, it opened doors to work with other entrepreneurs and other businesses, and led directly to what I'm doing now. So it was, an incredible experience.
Well, us storytellers out there, you and I and so many others in the business world, we try to find our niche. And, I do a lot of work with the and button, therefore, which I have found to be kind of that primal proving ground for storytelling. Once leaders and sales executives can get that ABT down, they can grow and become just more powerful, confident, persuasive communicators. And of course, I've got my 10-step story cycle system around branding. Your niche, however, you really own this, and you've staked it out as working with people on their origin story. So let's jump into that. And it may be obvious, but I'm not sure. Why do we need to explore and to share our origin stories?
Yeah, good question. I guess for me, what I've learned from working on origin stories over the past couple of years is that the origin story process, it really helps you reflect on your past to get a better understanding of who you are now. And by doing that, it can also serve as a roadmap for your future, essentially. The process is essentially about mining your past and translating the key turning points in your life and your career, your experiences, your expertise, your wins and your losses, into stories that you can use in different situations and different contexts. I suppose essentially it distills your business philosophy and your purpose into a powerful message, and it really helps people understand, what makes you tick. I think it does that by answering, 3 very important and deceptively simple questions, I guess. Who you are, where you've come from, and I suppose more importantly, why you do what you do. Now, again, some people, probably think, well, I don't need to do that. I make widgets and I sell a lot of widgets and I do what I do very, very well. But for a lot of people, I think it's so important that you give people a sense of who you are, because it's that old cliche, right? And people buy from people. People make up their minds about you, your product, your service, or your organization based on the stories that you tell and the stories that other people tell about you. Now, obviously, you can't control what other people say about you, but you, I suppose, can influence what they think by painting yourself in the best possible light. And the way to do that, I think, is to identify stories from your past that, I suppose, reassure your clients and your customers and your stakeholders that you are the real deal.
Yeah, Bezos of Amazon fame and now Rocket Man fame said that a brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room, which I think is a really great way of capturing it. I've tweaked it a little bit and saying, really, your brand is the stories people tell about you when you're not in the room. And if you have not armed them with the right stories that you've told them or that they've experienced with your company, your brand, your product or service, then they will make up their own story about you. And it will probably not be the story you intended unless you intentionally tell them your stories, starting with that backstory. Are there some things people can do right now, give them some coaching right now? And where do you begin in capturing these origin stories?
Yeah, I guess you start from the beginning. It's a very obvious answer and a simple answer, but for me, I have looked at it in very simple way. I've divided it into 3 stages. I look at the stories that shaped you, and for me, they're the stories of your formative years. Think between the ages of when you were born up to maybe the age of 18. So much happens during that period. You can think about where you're from, or what your parents did for a living, what values you learned from them, what you were interested in school, your first job. All of those are ripe, I think, for stories that can really, I suppose, reflect or talk to what you do now. And for me, that's one of the keys of the storytelling process is, there's a lot of misconceptions, I think, about storytelling. But for me, I think Sean Callahan, who I'm sure you know from Anecdote, he said it really well in his book, Putting Stories to Work. He said any story can be a business story as long as it has a business point. And that's one of the things I kind of emphasize to the people I work with.
Okay, Robert. So, let me ask you. And by the way, I know Sean Callahan very well. In fact, I did some training work with their storytellings for leaders, and I love the work that they do. And I had a chance to visit with him in Melbourne after visiting you all down in Auckland a couple of years ago and then ran up there. So let me ask you this, Robert. Can you share a story that has shaped who you are today, going back from that, from birth to 18 in there somewhere? Give us an example of a story that has shaped you.
Yeah. Okay. As I said, I grew up in the west of Ireland, and I grew up on a dairy farm milking cows, and wondering about the rain. And I always wondered, there has to be something more to life. And for me, my escape came in the form of words. Essentially, I loved reading from an early age. I mean, I often fell asleep with a book in my hands. I read the classics, people like Enid Blyton and Roald Dahl and Stephen King. And I loved getting lost in the worlds they created. Newspapers were also a very big part of my life growing up. I mean, the Irish have a reputation for being great storytellers. I don't think my family would be a storytelling family, but we were a story finding family. We used to, we were surrounded by newspapers all the time. My dad in particular loved sitting down with the newspaper at the end of the day on the farm. He used to buy a daily paper, a local paper, a regional paper, and every weekend he'd bring home 3 Sunday newspapers. So we were surrounded by stories and writing and good writing all the time. And for me, I suppose, I kind of figured from an early age that I had this kind of interest in stories and this interest in what made people tick. And when I was 13, my mum gave me a typewriter. Now, that's an unusual present for a teenager, you might think. I mean, I certainly did. But I think she recognized maybe something in me that was worth nurturing, that my love for words could lead somewhere. And sure enough, I taught myself how to touch type on the typewriter. I got a job at the local paper, a summer job at the local paper, and I volunteered as the sports editor for my school magazine. And so, from the age of about 17 or 18, I was committed to a career as a journalist. Or at least as committed as any 17-year-old can be, right? Because in my 20s, I kind of fell out of love with that idea and I drifted for a few years. But thankfully, I found my way back in my late 20s and rediscovered my passion for journalism and for writing. And 20 years later, I'm still doing it for a job. And I absolutely, love what I do.
So that's an example of a story that shapes who you are today. And, it's really funny when people are saying, well, Park, I don't have any stories to tell or nobody wants to hear my story. What I like to coach them on is just go to a moment, a moment in time that really surprised you, and maybe your curiosity took you somewhere, or it ignited a passion in you that you didn't even know you had. Like mine, I can distinctly remember it when I was a very little kid. I mean, maybe first grade. My grandmother Mabel, a Norwegian living in Minnesota, sitting down and playing an upright piano, and she was playing this ragtime stomp. And I remember sitting there just being amazed that this old lady could pound out that beautiful song, and she was just so animated doing that I can remember now, after all these decades, standing there listening to her and telling myself, I want to be able to do that. And that's what got me into piano lessons, into music composition and theory, and ultimately crossed over into journalism and where I am today, that intersection of story composition and theory. But I can remember that moment in time so distinctly. It had, that big of impact on me. I would imagine you do the same thing with your customers, is get them to take you to a moment in time.
Absolutely. It's all about identifying the moments, and it might be 4 or 5 key moments from the different stages, as I've talked about. And I'll get onto the other 2 stages in a moment. But I think the thing to bear in mind is, you may hear that story, or you may think about some stories from those formative years, and you think, well, there's no way I would want to share that story with anybody. And that's fine too. You don't necessarily have to share it with the world. It might be a story you pull out and use at some stage when the time is right. But as I said earlier, it's as much about the process and kind of discovering, well, what are the kind of common themes and the common threads in my life and in my life experiences, in the memorable emotional experiences of my life that really have had an impact on what I do now. So yeah, again, I think don't get too hung up on whether you're going to actually use the stories that you uncover and unpack during this process. It's really just going through it and becoming aware of those stories is really valuable in itself.
It's a self-reflection thing, isn't it? Real quick before you get to the second stage, it's a self-reflection thing, and I'm just going through it with, are you familiar with Jordan Peterson?
Yes.
He's this professor, out of University of Toronto, and I just started following his work and watching him and jumped on his selfauthoring.com just to go in and kind of do my own self-evaluation of my pros and cons, my what do I value and what are my faults and how am I going to deal with it? And it was really interesting because they are always asking in those exercises, take us to a moment when this particular fault of yours got in your way and tell us a story about that moment. And as I was going through that, I was thinking about you, because I was thinking this must be the same kind of process that you take your customers through too. So with that, what's number 2 on your list?
Yeah, I must check that out, Park. That sounds really interesting. Just before I get onto that as well, you had, I think, Dov Barron on the show a couple of weeks ago, or maybe a couple of months ago. I was listening to it over the weekend, and he explores a similar area, and it was really interesting listening to him about that self-reflection process and about how, quite often, we don't realize the significance of the stories that we have in our heads until we actually take the time to reflect on them. I think he said, he put it like, I think the image he used was, a fish cannot describe water. One of my clients said to me, you can't read the label from inside the jar, which I really like. I like that image. And that's why sitting down and reflecting on these stories is so helpful. The second stage is the stories that changed you. And again, this, in rough terms, I generally think of this as kind of in your 20s or your 30s. It's kind of when you're out in the wilderness, out in the world on your own, trying to find your place in the world, trying to find what floats your boat, where you fit, how you can, make an impact. And in those years, in that stage of your life, there'll be some seriously key decisions that you have to make. Think of that movie Sliding Doors. There'll be sliding doors moments where you have to choose the left door or the right door, and depending on which decision you make, it's going to have a massive impact. So yeah, as I say, it's only a guideline, that time period, your 20s or your 30s, but the stories that changed you are those kind of key decisions that you have to make that change everything. And the final stage then is the stories that define you. And we'll get onto that in a minute, Park.
Robert, with these three stages, are these something that you experienced and developed as a journalist, as you were interviewing these extreme artists and athletes at Red Bull, that would get you to dive deeper into their backstories? That's where this all came from?
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially is that kind of storytelling technique, that journalism technique, to try and figure out, how did you get to where you are now, and reflecting back on their past. For me, the process kind of came about when I founded or set up my own company after I left journalism, which was about 3-4 years ago. As I said, I saw the writing on the wall for journalism, and I saw the opportunity to work with entrepreneurs and businesses. And it was an obvious thing for me to do, to start writing on LinkedIn and sharing my stories on LinkedIn, because that's where my audience lived. And it was during that process that I started, digging into my own origin story, kind of almost by accident, Park, I'll be honest with you. But what I realized was that the more of these personal stories that I shared, with a meaning, as I said, with an intent, the stories that I shared all kind of related back to my passion for writing and interviewing people and understanding what made them tick. But the more of these stories that I started to share, the more positive kind of feedback and engagement I started to get. And I started reading other people in this area, obviously. Started reading your posts and your book, and people like Jonathan Gottschall and Will Storr and lots of people that you've had on your show. And started to just pull this notion together of using my journalism skills and my interviewing skills and combining that with this storytelling, I suppose, and branding side of things, to come up with the origin story process.
We'll be back to learn about Robert Tighe's third stage of developing your origin story right after this message from Wix. If you want to sell online, you got to stand out. So go to Wix e-commerce and create an online store that will absolutely grab your shopper's attention. You can build a state-of-the-art storefront, showcase your product with striking product pages, and even sell subscriptions. With Wix e-commerce, you can go global and display prices in local currencies. You can even boost your sales by offering instant coupons using the live chat. Now you can streamline your checkout process with automated shipping fees and sales tax calculation. You can even manage your inventory and track your sales from one convenient dashboard while you analyze your comprehensive sales and traffic reports. So check out these and more must-have e-commerce features for sellers just like you who absolutely mean business. Go to wix.com/e-commerce today and join over 700,000 active stores selling worldwide with Wix e-commerce. Well, it's awesome. So we've got through two stages. That first stage of the stories that shaped you. So you're thinking about birth through 18, those formative years. And then when you were thrown out of the nest, you're out on your own, ages 20 through 30s, the stories that changed you in this process. So what's the third stage?
The third stage is the stories that define you now, essentially. So I think really taking a close look at your role or your position or the industry you're in, and I suppose trying to pinpoint, well, what exactly is it about this industry or this role that I'm passionate about? How did I end up in this role? One way of doing that is to kind of, again, it's to reflect back on an earlier period of your life is often an effective way of doing this. I encourage clients to think about the very first time that they became aware of the concept of what they do now. For example, I was working with a customer experience consultant recently, and for the first 20 minutes, he was trying to explain what a CX consultant did. And he was talking in jargon, and after 20 minutes, I was, none the wiser about what he did. So I asked him to stop, and I asked him to tell me what your very first kind of understanding or appreciation of what the word customer meant. It might have been when you spent your own money as a customer, or it might be when you worked in your first job and you were serving customers. And you could see him pause and go, really? But then he just launched into these, wonderful stories he talked about his first paper round, where very quickly he realized that if he didn't get out of bed on time, then the paper wasn't delivered on time and the customer wasn't happy. the customer would complain to his boss and he wouldn't get paid. So he had this very clear understanding of the need to keep the customer satisfied, right? And that was kind of, that progressed throughout his career, even though he came to customer experience work and CX work quite late in his career. And that was a concern for him because he was wondering, how do I make sense of my past roles and yet explain the fact that I am passionate about CX? And he was able to do that by reflecting on these stories. You know, he worked as a scuba diving instructor at one stage, and that was all about delivering a great customer experience and putting his customers at ease. So taking away all the jargon and all the, I suppose, the one-liners that made him sound like every other CX consultant in the business really helped him, I suppose, just figure out, okay, I can stand behind what I do as a customer experience consultant because I've been working with customers all my life.
Isn't that funny? Yeah, because you can then really see the person in there versus some business guy or gal out there pounding their chest, telling you how great they are at CX. You kind of proof them out by having them share a story and their own experience in the past. His paper route reminded me of a time when I had a paper route too for many, many years and had to deliver every afternoon and then Sunday mornings, the big new Seattle Times paper back in the day. And I remember this one bum of a guy had this mean old German Shepherd, and he decided he wasn't going to pay me. And I've had pretty good success getting paid, Robert, and I came across this guy and he just wasn't going to pay me 1 month. So I talked to my mom and dad about it, and they said, well, keep delivering the paper, keep showing up, persistence, and you'll get your money. Well, I persisted all month long. Every week I would go over there, knock on his door, and he never paid me. He would always have an excuse. And then it got to the second month, and now he owed me for 2 months, and my mom couldn't take it anymore. God bless her. And she said, get in the car park. We're going to go get your money. And I jumped in the town and country station wagon, and we drove over there. And she was a bit of a spitfire, and she went up, and I could hear that German Shepherd barking in the house, and that didn't detour her at all. And she pounded on that door, and he came, and she was nice at first. She introduced herself. I'm Park's mom. Apparently you haven't paid him for last month and you owe him for this month. We're here to collect. And he said, well, I'm not going to pay you, ma'am. I'm just, I don't care what you do. I'm just not paying. And she got so mad, she turned completely red. I thought she was going to smack the guy. And she sat there shaking and she said, you crumb. And then she turned around and she walked back in and got in the car and said, stop delivering him any papers whatsoever. And I just cracked up. I thought, here's my mom. She's so great. She was standing up for me because this guy wasn't going to pay, this 12-year-old boy now at this point. And she went up there and lost it. I thought she was going to come completely unraveled. And yet she caught herself. And she just called him a crumb. It could have been a lot worse. And it was also maybe, Robert, because I was in the car too. But I remember that indelibly stamped in my mind that no matter how sideways you might get with a customer, and maybe that customer really is a crumb, it's best to walk away with your dignity intact. And that's what I learned from that story, that moment in time. That did have a bit of an impact on me.
I love it. And that's a great example of how you can make sense of some of these stories, right? They may be just kind of buried deep in your brain. You may have not thought about them for a long time. You may have told them to other people so many times that you maybe failed to realize the significance of them. That's another thing. One of my favorite examples is a client I worked with recently who's a professional speaker, a motivational speaker, and a workshop facilitator. And as part of her uncovering her origin story, I asked her about growing up in East Germany. She was originally from East Germany, and she told me that it was, like growing up in an army boot camp. She went to school 6 days a week, and school started at 7 o'clock in the morning. And at 10 o'clock, the bell rang for a long break, and every child was sent outside, rain, hail, or shine, and there was a big white circle painted in the schoolyard. And these kids had to march around this white line, this circle, for 20 minutes. That was their exercise, essentially. And while they walked around the circle, the teachers were stationed at different points. And if anybody stepped off the circle, if anybody stepped off the white line, the teachers would shout at them, get back in line, walk the line. And she told me the story, and she finished, and I said, "Have you ever used that story before? Have you ever told that story before in a workshop?" And she said, "No, it's just a story. That's how I grew up." And and I said to her, "No, it's much more than that. If you think about that image, that story about walking around in circles, what you do is you help people to stop walking in circles, to get off the treadmill of life, to think outside the circle, if you like." And you could see that aha moment. She kind of, it lit up for her, and I've talked to her since, and she uses that story now as the intro to her keynotes and her speeches, because it's just such a powerful image, right?
It absolutely is. And I was, just as you were telling that story, I was multitasking on you, and I was looking through my book, Brand Bewitchery, on a story that I wanted to share with you about a lady that I was doing some training for a sales team. And she got up to tell her story, and I noticed that she didn't tell the whole story. She was leaving something out. And although she still had very much, attracted the attention of her colleagues, she came up to me afterwards and, said, "Park, I didn't tell you the entire story." I said, "I know that. Why not?" And then she went in to tell the story. She goes, "Well, here it is. People don't want to hear it." And what it is, the story is she grew up in Ukraine and in a Ukrainian orphanage. So all you got to say is Ukrainian orphanage, and you already can picture maybe not the greatest living conditions ever. And she was, abused within the orphanage, and she learned at a very young age that she needed to sit back and really understand the kids and the adults that she could trust by observation. She was taking this all in, and then she befriended them and created this support group for everyone involved there. And it's what helped her survive that orphanage, finally moved to America. She got 2 different degrees and an MBA, and she worked for Silverline, which is a CRM company out here, in partnership development. And Robert, after she told me that story, I was completely floored. And I said, "You need to tell this story because of your background. I mean, just for survival, you were in partnership development. You surveyed, the landscape there at the orphanage. You pulled into your inner circle kids you could trust and adults you could trust so that you could survive this. And then you moved on, obviously, in a very industrious way, got your degrees, and now you are essentially the go-to person for Silverline in building out their corporate partnerships and their vendor partnerships and whatever." I said, "That is a marvelous story. Talking about rags to riches, it's the American dream, but you have experienced this from the most primal level. No wonder you are so good at this." I mean, I even said you could use it to some point to say, as a vendor coming in or a partner coming in, you want to be here because I will always be at your side. I will never orphan you in the process. And she was like, "Whoa!" But it's going to what you're talking about. It's finding those very primal times in our lives that have impacted who we are today and formed who we are today that we call upon, and we don't even realize it. We don't even realize we're doing that. Yeah. And that's, I think, one of the powers you said, being very cathartic as you were writing these origin stories. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I think in listening to this, people are thinking, well, my origin story will help me sell more stuff. But you're saying it is as important for you as a leader to really understand and appreciate and embrace your own story so that you can have that stronger impact in the world.
Yeah, I guess I'll start by maybe talking about the fear factor, Park. And I'm guessing that lady you talked to, I'm guessing fear was one of the things that maybe stopping her from telling her story. And it's very easy to talk about reflecting on your story and maybe sharing it with the world, but there's a real fear factor, I guess, I think, in putting yourself out there, right? Vulnerability is a real buzzword at the moment. And there is that question, well, how vulnerable do I need to be? For me, there's different schools of thought on this. I think, again, Dov Barron, I think, talked about reflecting on your shame story. I don't tend to do that so much. I don't think that you need to reveal all the skeletons in your closet. Again, it refers back to, any story can be a business story as long as it has a business point. That's where I tend to focus my energies. But in terms of that, cathartic nature of it, yeah, there's a real weight off, I think, when you reflect on these stories and you make sense of them. There is this notion of kind of reframing or reinterpreting your stories. And that's something that I did myself, as part of my own origin story kind of process. When I left university, I went to university, as I said, determined to be a journalist. And I went to study English and sociology and politics. But I got distracted by cigarettes and alcohol park, and I had a really great time at university.
Hey,
really,
it happens.
Yeah, it was wonderful. I had a great time in my 20s, but I came to associate writing with exams and boring papers on sociology, and it turned me off writing for quite a few years. And as a result, I spent my 20s working in a series of odd jobs. I worked in sales, I worked in recruitment, I worked in human resources. So, I worked in lots of different jobs, but never really found my passion. To be honest, I hated a lot of those jobs that I worked in. They just weren't a good fit for me. Later on, I started calling them the lost years, because that's essentially what they felt like. They felt like the lost years. And it was funny. For most of my 20s, I'd wake up on a Monday morning, or even on a Sunday afternoon, it started used to creep in, the Monday terrors, that knot in your stomach of going to a job that you hated, that you knew wasn't a good fit for you, right? And all the time, I was also kind of ignoring a gut feeling that I should be writing, that, what I, was into it as a teenager, that, working on the school magazine and the summer job at the local paper, that's what I should be doing. But I resisted it for quite a long time. I ran away from it. And then finally in my 20s, I was in a bookshop, and I picked up a book by Tony Robbins called Awaken the Power Within. Now, terrible, cheesy title, and I would have been a self-help skeptic. But I really think that book changed so much for me. It made me realize that we get to live our lives by choice, not by chance. And once I went through the exercises in that book and started writing down my goals and what I wanted, it changed everything. I quit my job to become a writer. I went back to my hometown and got a job with my local paper. I ended up getting married to my New Zealand girlfriend and moving to New Zealand within a year or two of reading that book as well. So much changed for me. But it was only when I took the time to reflect on that period in my own life a couple of years ago as part of the origin story process that I was able to reframe it. And I realized that while I was working in those jobs that I hated, I was learning such valuable skills. I was learning, how to pick up a phone, how to pick up the phone and make cold calls to customers. I was learning how to interview people as a recruitment consultant. I was learning how to tell when someone was bluffing or not. And all those skills really made me qualified or set me up to be a journalist, even though I had no qualifications. So that's what I mean by reframing experiences and that notion of it being cathartic, because, we all have these little stories in the back of our head that we go, I'm not too proud of that. But I think there is value in reflecting on it and reinterpreting it in a different way. It's your story after all. It's your truth, right?
It is. I just wrote down moving from catastrophic to cathartic. You could actually get benefit out of that reframing. And we've all been there. We've all felt like we've wasted time or got stuck in the wrong job or just completely went down the wrong alley and wasted a year, 2 or 3 of our lives. Who knows? But when you look back, you're right. It's all of those activities that make up who we are today and what really powers us, brings our talent to the world so that we can help other people in our own unique way, following our own unique journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, there probably are skeptics out there who, scoff at this notion of finding yourself. I was watching Bob Dylan on, I think it's the Rolling Thunder review on Netflix recently, and he came up with this great line. He said, life isn't about finding yourself or finding anything. It's about creating yourself and creating things. And I love that idea that, that it's your story. You get to create the meaning. And that's a pretty cool image, I think.
Well, and if you don't take advantage of that and be proactive and take responsibility for it, the universe is going to create the story for you. And probably it's not going to be the story you really care to be living in. I mean, that's what I've really been learning from this Jordan Peterson. I've had a friend of mine, Pete Walsh, who's a coach, a family business coach. He's been on the show a couple of times, great friend of mine. And he's been talking about this Jordan Peterson character for couple of years, and I just really hadn't looked into him, and I started studying him and go, wow. I mean, he, psychologist, he works from the Jungian camp, Joseph Campbell, he's always talking about story in this, and there's so many of the ideas that I can really embrace, but he says, the story thing is not easy. This is not a simple thing, living it or being human, that our jobs are to address the conflicts and the catastrophes that we are all going to be hit by. and take them on, live through them, and live to fight another day and come out, hopefully a wiser person. And it pushes back on this idea of happiness, that it's not about going and finding happiness, that you find the happiness by walking that thin trail between control and chaos. And we are always trying to balance those two things, and we see it in our early years, we see it in our formative years in building businesses and with all the people we work with. Our job is to help try to balance and bring order out of the chaos that befalls us all.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of looking at it. The other thing that I like to think about is, as businesses and business people and entrepreneurs are so focused on the future, right? They're so focused on what's next, the 3-year plan, the 5-year plan, the 25-year plan. And rarely, they've got the blinkers on and they're full steam ahead, but rarely do they take time to reflect and take time out. Steve Jobs of Apple, probably one of the most quoted men on the planet, but he's got this, you may have heard this before, I'm sure. You can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect the dots looking backwards. And again, that's a really, I think, cool image and a cool concept to think about. The idea of you can't connect the dots looking forward, to me, that's, talks to the fact that, you can make all the plans you like, but you have no idea what's coming down the track, right? None of us could have predicted COVID, right? But we all can reflect on, where we've been and join those dots. We all have these origin stories that help us make sense of who we are and where we've come from and why we do what we do. And by reflecting on our past, it can serve as a roadmap for our future, and it can help you find your purpose. I'm biased, obviously, but I do firmly believe that there's real value in taking time out to do that now, maybe now more than ever.
Robert, where can people find out more about you? And do you have any sort of worksheet or something that they could work from that we might include in the show notes, or a link to it anyways?
Yeah, I don't have a worksheet, Park, but they can find me at www.roberttighe.com. That's ROBERTTIGHE.com. And I can work on pulling together something for you, Park, if that would be of interest.
Well, I think would be interest to our listeners, certainly. And all the shows I've done, we've never really focused on the origin story. And that's why I was so eager to get you here for 2022, because what better time to really understand and craft your origin story than at the beginning of this year. So at the end of it, you have something you can reflect back on and even see how maybe it changed a little bit in the process. So if you had something great, if you don't, no problem at all. We will send them over to Robert Tighe, Tighe. That's a silent Ghe. I had to ask that, folks, at the beginning of the show, too. I wasn't quite sure, but he said that's the Irish way of spelling Tighe, Tie, apparently.
That's correct, and I'm on LinkedIn as well, Park. Obviously, I think that's where we found each other through Glenn Marvin. So, yeah, I post regularly on LinkedIn about storytelling and your origin story.
Well, Robert, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. I really appreciate it.
Park, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've really, really enjoyed it, and thanks so much for the opportunity.
Absolutely. And thank you all for being here, this special edition of the Business of Story. Hey, if you're trying to share your origin story out there, listen to the show again. Go over to Robert's site. He can really help you pull that together. If you know of someone that would benefit from pulling together their story, share this episode with them. Let them, introduce them to Robert and his work. And again, as I mentioned to Robert, if you want to do something that's really interesting, this selfauthoring.com with Jordan Peterson might be a good place to start, and then connect with Robert to help him really flesh that out for you and your brand story moving forward. Of course, if there's anything I can do for you, working with the ABTs of selling or working on your own brand story, visit me over at businessofstory.com. I have that online course just waiting for you, businessofstory.thinkific.com, the ABTs of selling. I will be launching, if I haven't already, because I've done this recording a little bit early, pre-2022, we're going to have the ABTs of branding and the ABTs of leadership. And again, this is teaching you the foundational narrative framework of setup problem resolution that uses the three forces of story: agreement, contradiction, consequence, that our cause and effect pattern-seeking brain absolutely loves, to help you use this for all of your storytelling. Whether you are telling that origin story or that future story or that why I do what I do story, the ABT will work for you. So check it out at businessofstory.thinkific.com. And of course, we have our fairly new book out now called The Narrative Gym for Business. That is a quick 75-page deep dive into how to use the ABT in all of your storytelling. So thank you so much for listening. Join us next Monday when we will have another story artist right back here for you like Robert. And until then, remember that the most potent story you'll ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thanks so much for listening.